The story of Anakin Skywalker is a tragic arc that underscores the consequences of rigidity, detachment, and emotional suppression within the Jedi Order. As the Chosen One, Anakin was prophesied to bring balance to the Force, yet he became the harbinger of its greatest darkness. To understand his fall to Darth Vader, one must critically examine the Jedi Order and how its detachment and emotional repression directly contributed to Anakin's descent. The Jedi's inability to adapt their dogma to the realities of human emotion created a chasm between them and the young man they were tasked to guide. This failure was not a singular act, but a gradual erosion of trust, belonging, and understanding, leaving Anakin vulnerable to the manipulative embrace of the dark side. From the outset, the Jedi's ethos placed significant restrictions on emotional expression. They equated attachment with possessiveness, fear, and loss, drawing a linear path to the dark side. While there was wisdom in the understanding that unchecked emotions could lead to destructive outcomes, the Jedi misjudged the complexity of human nature. Their philosophy was rooted in an ideal of selflessness that denied the value of personal bonds and attachments, viewing them as liabilities rather than strengths. This was especially dangerous for someone like Anakin, whose life had been defined by emotional extremes long before he joined the Jedi. Anakin's early life as a slave on Tatooine exposed him to suffering, fear, and a deep yearning for freedom. His strong attachment to his mother, Shmi, was a natural result of these circumstances. She was his anchor in a cruel and uncertain world. When Qui-Gon Jinn brought Anakin to Coruscant, the Jedi Council hesitated to train him precisely because of this attachment. Yoda and others foresaw the potential for Anakin's fear of loss to lead him astray, but instead of addressing this fear with understanding and compassion, they chose to suppress it entirely. By teaching Anakin that his emotions were a weakness, they inadvertently isolated him from the very support system he needed to confront his inner struggles. The Jedi's detachment was most evident in their handling of Anakin's grief and fear. When Anakin began to experience premonitions of his mother's suffering, the Jedi dismissed them as distractions. Their teachings encouraged him to let go of his attachments and accept loss as a natural part of existence. However, such advice rang hollow to someone who had experienced the brutality of losing loved ones firsthand. The Jedi Order, in its lofty detachment, underestimated the strength of Anakin's emotional bonds. When he found Shmi dying in the clutches of the Tusken Raiders, his anguish erupted into violence, culminating in a massacre. This moment was a clear indication that the Jedi's methods were insufficient for someone of Anakin's temperament and experiences. Instead of helping him process his grief and guilt, the Jedi offered platitudes about serenity and balance, further alienating him. Another critical failure of the Jedi Order was their inability to recognize the importance of mentorship and personal connection. Obi-Wan Kenobi, while a skilled and dedicated Jedi, was thrust into the role of Anakin's master under less than ideal circumstances. He had promised Qui-Gon to train Anakin, but his own youth and inexperience made him ill-suited for the task. Unlike Qui-Gon, who had a more flexible and empathetic approach to the Jedi Code, Obi-Wan was a staunch traditionalist. His adherence to the Order's rigid principles often clashed with Anakin's impulsive and passionate nature. While Obi-Wan cared deeply for Anakin, their relationship was more akin to that of a strict older brother than a guiding father figure. Anakin needed someone who could understand and validate his emotions, but instead he was met with discipline and restraint. The Jedi Council further exacerbated Anakin's sense of isolation by treating him with suspicion and withholding their trust. Despite his significant contributions during the Clone Wars and his status as the Chosen One, they often viewed him as a potential liability. This mistrust came to a head when they denied him the rank of Jedi Master, despite granting him a seat on the Council. For Anakin, this was not merely an insult to his pride, but a confirmation of the Council's lack of faith in him. The Jedi's detachment blinded them to the damage their actions inflicted on Anakin's psyche. Their refusal to address his frustrations and ambitions left him vulnerable to the manipulations of Palpatine, who offered the validation and understanding the Jedi withheld. Palpatine's role in Anakin's fall cannot be overstated, but his success was predicated on the Jedi's failures. Where the Jedi sought to suppress Anakin's emotions, Palpatine embraced them. He recognized Anakin's fear of loss, his anger, and his desire for control, using these feelings to draw him closer to the dark side. By presenting himself as a mentor and confidant, Palpatine filled the void left by the Jedi's detachment. He appealed to Anakin's sense of loyalty and justice while subtly encouraging his doubts about the Jedi's motives. The Jedi Order's emotional distance made it easy for Palpatine to position himself as the only figure who truly understood Anakin's struggles. One of the most poignant examples of the Jedi's failure was their response to Anakin's relationship with Padmé Amidala. From the moment Anakin and Padmé reunited, it was clear that their bond was far more than a passing infatuation. However, the Jedi Code forbade attachments, forcing Anakin to hide his love for Padmé from the Order. This secrecy placed immense strain on their relationship and on Anakin himself. Rather than addressing the natural human need for connection, the Jedi demanded that Anakin deny this aspect of his humanity. This denial created a rift between Anakin and the Order, as he felt compelled to choose between his duty as a Jedi and his love for Padmé. When Anakin began experiencing visions of Padmé's death, his desperation to save her drove him to seek answers outside the Jedi teachings. The Council's cold and dismissive attitude only heightened his sense of alienation. Instead of offering him guidance and support, they instructed him to be mindful and let go of his fear. Their inability to acknowledge the gravity of his emotions or provide a viable solution pushed Anakin further into Palpatine's influence. The Sith Lord exploited Anakin's fear of loss, presenting the dark side as the only path to saving Padmé. By the time Anakin turned to Palpatine for guidance, the Jedi had already lost their grip on him. The Jedi Order's failure to adapt their teachings to Anakin's unique circumstances was emblematic of their larger downfall. Their rigid adherence to tradition and detachment from the realities of individual struggles left them ill-equipped to handle a figure as complex as Anakin. They saw themselves as guardians of peace and justice, yet their lack of empathy and understanding undermined their ability to fulfill this role. The tragedy of Anakin Skywalker was not solely his inability to overcome his inner turmoil, but the Jedi's failure to help him navigate it. Their detachment and emotional suppression created an environment in which Anakin's fears and frustrations could fester unchecked, ultimately leading to his transformation into Darth Vader. The fall of the Jedi Order and the rise of the Sith were inextricably linked to this fundamental flaw in their philosophy. Anakin's story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of dogma and the importance of understanding and addressing the emotional needs of those we seek to guide. The Jedi's inability to embrace the full spectrum of human experience, both its light and its darkness, cost them not only Anakin but the very balance they sought to protect. Their detachment, far from preserving peace, became the catalyst for one of the galaxy's darkest chapters. The fall of Anakin Skywalker is often framed as a descent into selfish ambition and unchecked power. Yet at its core lies a profound tragedy. Anakin was driven by a deeply selfless desire to protect those he loved. His downfall was not born purely out of a lust for dominance, but from an earnest attempt to save Padmé Amidala, the woman who represented the heart of his world. His selflessness, however, became his undoing as it collided with the inflexible doctrines of the Jedi Order and the manipulative cunning of Palpatine. Anakin's quest to do something noble, saving Padmé, placed him in a terrible trap, one carefully designed to exploit his virtues and twist them into his destruction. Anakin's visions of Padmé's death during childbirth were not mere dreams but harrowing premonitions, the same kind of forewarning that had led him to his mother's tragic end. His failure to save Shammai weighed heavily on him, and the trauma of her loss burned deeply into his psyche. For Anakin, the possibility of losing Padmé was unthinkable. Padmé embodied everything he had fought to protect, a symbol of love, hope, and the future he desired beyond the turmoil of war. His determination to save her was not rooted in selfish possession, but in his genuine belief that he could rewrite the fate he had once failed to challenge. The Jedi Order's rigid detachment only deepened Anakin's sense of urgency and isolation. When he sought guidance from the Jedi, they dismissed his fears, treating them as distractions or manifestations of attachment. Their advice stoically to accept the possibility of loss came from a place of philosophical detachment, one utterly incompatible with the raw humanity of Anakin's dilemma. Instead of addressing the fear and love driving Anakin's actions, they sought to suppress them, leaving him feeling abandoned and misunderstood. Palpatine, in stark contrast, provided what the Jedi refused: a sense of validation. Under the guise of a wise and compassionate mentor, the Sith Lord sympathized with Anakin's plight and subtly reinforced the idea that the Jedi did not understand him. Palpatine presented himself as an ally who shared Anakin's goals and respected his emotions, offering a seductive alternative to the cold logic of the Jedi. Most devastatingly, Palpatine claimed knowledge of a power to prevent death and ability to save Padmé from the fate Anakin so desperately feared. This promise was not framed as an act of evil or domination, but as a means to preserve life. In Anakin's mind, embracing this path was not a betrayal of his ideals, but a necessary sacrifice for the woman he loved. Anakin's intentions remained selfless, even as his choices drew him closer to darkness. His actions were not born out of a desire for power or personal gain, but from the conviction that his abilities gave him a responsibility to protect those he cared for. He had already witnessed the limits of the Jedi's capacity to prevent suffering, and he refused to allow Padmé to become another casualty of their passivity. This sense of duty, however noble in origin, was skillfully manipulated by Palpatine, who reframed Anakin's selflessness as a justification for compromising his values. Each step deeper into the Sith's influence felt to Anakin like an act of love and necessity, not betrayal or ambition. The tragedy of Anakin's fall lies in how his noblest instincts were weaponized against him. When he pledged himself to Palpatine, it was not with the intent of overthrowing the Jedi or seizing galactic power, but as a desperate act to save Padmé. He believed that the power of the dark side was a tool, a means to an end. In his mind, this was a sacrifice he had to make for the greater good, one that transcended the rigid constraints of the Jedi Code. His descent into darkness was framed, to him, as an act of courage, a willingness to shoulder the burden of morally gray actions to protect the person he loved most. Yet this selflessness, tragically, became the mechanism of his downfall. Palpatine's trap was designed to ensure that Anakin's moral compromise spiraled into complete submission. The dark side preyed on his fear of failure, his guilt over past losses, and his hope for a better future with Padmé. Every step Anakin took to prevent her death only deepened his reliance on the very forces that would ensure her demise. The dark side fed on his desperation, twisting his intentions until the line between selflessness and selfishness blurred beyond recognition. The Jedi's inability to understand or support Anakin compounded this trap. By denying him the space to openly confront his fears and feelings, they left him to wrestle with them alone. Their detachment created a void that Palpatine was only too willing to fill. The Jedi's rigid insistence that emotional attachment was inherently dangerous ignored the reality of Anakin's situation. He wasn't consumed by greed or ambition, but by love and the fear of loss. Their refusal to acknowledge the complexity of his emotions turned their philosophy into an unreachable ideal, one that offered no solace or guidance to someone fighting to protect those he cared about. When Anakin ultimately fell, it was not because he sought power for its own sake, but because he believed he was doing the right thing. In his confrontation with Mace Windu, Anakin's decision to intervene was driven by the belief that Palpatine's survival was necessary to save Padmé. His subsequent attack on the Jedi Temple, while horrific, was framed in his mind as a grim necessity, a step towards securing the power to prevent Padmé's death. Each act of darkness was rationalized as a means to an end, a sacrifice for the greater good. Anakin saw himself as a savior, even as the dark side consumed him. The ultimate irony is that Anakin's selflessness achieved the opposite of what he intended. By surrendering to the dark side in the hope of saving Padmé, he became the instrument of her destruction. His transformation into Darth Vader severed the very bonds he sought to protect, leaving him isolated and consumed by regret. The dark side promised salvation but delivered only despair, and Anakin's noble intentions were corrupted into acts of horror. This devastating outcome underscores the true tragedy of his fall. It was not the result of malice or greed, but of a flawed attempt to do good. The Jedi Order's failure to understand this aspect of Anakin's character was their greatest mistake. They viewed his attachment as a weakness, rather than a reflection of his humanity and his potential strength. Had they recognized the selflessness driving his actions and provided him with the tools to navigate his emotions, they might have prevented his fall. Instead, their detachment and inflexibility left him vulnerable to the manipulations of the Sith. The tragedy of Anakin Skywalker is a testament to the dangers of failing to embrace the complexity of human nature. His story serves as a cautionary tale about how even the most selfless intentions can be twisted into instruments of destruction when they are met with misunderstanding and exploitation. The fall of Anakin Skywalker was not simply a failure of character, but a systemic failure of the Jedi Order to adapt their teachings to the needs of the individual. Their inability to address the emotional realities of Anakin's situation left him searching for answers in the wrong places. In the end, his quest to save Padmé became a tragedy of love turned to loss, selflessness turned to destruction, and hope turned to despair. The tragedy of the Jedi Order's downfall and the rise of Darth Vader is inseparably tied to their inability to adapt and their failure to guide Anakin Skywalker effectively. At the heart of this catastrophe lies a deeply flawed philosophy that sought to suppress emotion and attachment while remaining rigid in the face of a galaxy undergoing seismic shifts. This detachment not only alienated Anakin, leading him to fall into the clutches of Darth Sidious, but also blinded the Jedi to the larger danger posed by the Sith Lord. Their inability to evolve in the face of an ever-changing galaxy made them architects of their own destruction, leaving the Jedi Order vulnerable to manipulation and ultimately complicit in its collapse. The Jedi's treatment of Anakin Skywalker exemplifies their failure on multiple levels. From the moment Qui-Gon Jinn introduced Anakin to the Council, they were wary of him, focusing on his fear and emotional attachments rather than his potential. Anakin, a child raised in slavery, bore the scars of a life filled with hardship and loss. His attachment to his mother and his innate yearning for connection were not flaws but natural responses to his experiences. Instead of addressing these needs with empathy, the Jedi dismissed them as dangerous. Their philosophy, which equated attachment with weakness and emotional bonds with the dark side, created a chasm between Anakin and the Order. This detachment was not only philosophical but institutional. The Jedi's insistence on detachment may have suited monks and warriors who grew up within the Order's sheltered structure, but it was ill-suited to someone like Anakin, whose life before the Jedi had been marked by deep and personal emotional ties. The Jedi attempted to mold him into their ideal by suppressing his natural emotions rather than helping him understand and channel them productively. This was particularly damaging for someone with Anakin's immense power and prophetic significance. Rather than embracing the complexity of Anakin's situation, the Jedi rigidly adhered to a doctrine that left him isolated, misunderstood, and ultimately vulnerable. This inability to adapt to Anakin's unique needs was mirrored in the Jedi's handling of the larger threats facing the galaxy. As the Clone Wars unfolded, the Jedi Order allowed itself to be consumed by the demands of war, becoming generals and warriors in direct contradiction to their role as peacekeepers. Their rigid adherence to their dogma, coupled with their increasing involvement in politics and military affairs, made them blind to the deeper danger growing within the Republic. Palpatine, operating in plain sight, masterfully exploited the Jedi's weaknesses. He used their rigidity, their detachment, and their inability to see the full scope of the conflict to orchestrate their downfall. Palpatine's rise was not a sudden coup, but a gradual and meticulously crafted plan that unfolded over decades. His ability to rise to power was facilitated by the Jedi's failure to recognize the changing nature of the galaxy and their place within it. The Jedi clung to their traditional roles and assumptions, even as Palpatine dismantled the Republic's democratic foundations and consolidated his power. They became tools of a system they were supposed to protect, unwittingly aiding in their own marginalization. Their focus on external threats blinded them to the internal danger, allowing Palpatine to weave his web unchecked. The same rigidity that doomed their relationship with Anakin also hampered their ability to confront Palpatine. The Jedi Code, with its insistence on emotional suppression, was poorly suited to dealing with a figure like Palpatine, who thrived on exploiting emotions and personal connections. Palpatine's manipulation of Anakin was a direct result of the Jedi's failure to provide Anakin with the emotional support he needed. Palpatine positioned himself as a mentor and confidant, offering Anakin the validation and understanding that the Jedi refused to provide. He framed his power as a tool to protect those Anakin loved, particularly Padmé, exploiting Anakin's selfless desire to save her. This exploitation was only possible because the Jedi had failed to teach Anakin how to reconcile his emotions with his role as a Jedi. Their philosophy treated his fear, love, and pain as obstacles to be suppressed rather than challenges to be addressed. When Anakin experienced visions of Padmé's death, the Jedi's advice to let go of his fear and accept loss as inevitable was not only inadequate but dismissive. Their refusal to adapt their teachings to Anakin's circumstances left him searching for answers elsewhere. Palpatine capitalized on this, presenting himself as the only one who understood Anakin's plight and offering the dark side as the solution. Anakin's fall was not simply a result of his own failings, but the culmination of the Jedi's inability to bridge the gap between their ideals and the reality of human nature. They created an environment where Anakin's noblest intentions to protect and save the ones he loved were twisted into acts of horror. By failing to guide Anakin through his struggles, the Jedi allowed Palpatine to mold him into a weapon of the dark side. Anakin's transformation into Darth Vader was as much a tragedy of the Jedi's shortcomings as it was a triumph of Palpatine's cunning. This same rigidity and detachment sealed the Jedi's fate as an institution. Their inability to recognize Palpatine's manipulation until it was too late was emblematic of their larger failure to adapt. The Jedi clung to their traditional methods and perspectives even as the galaxy around them changed. Their lack of foresight and their alienation from the people they were sworn to protect made them ineffective in the face of Palpatine's schemes. By the time they recognized the true extent of the Sith's influence, their position within the Republic had already been undermined, and their enemies had the upper hand. Order 66, the execution of the Jedi across the galaxy, was the final manifestation of their failure. The clones whom the Jedi had led into battle turned on them without hesitation, a reflection of how far the Jedi had strayed from their principles. Their detachment from the realities of war, their failure to question the origins of the clone army, and their inability to see Palpatine's endgame all contributed to their downfall. The Jedi had become soldiers in a war they didn't understand, pawns in a game orchestrated by their enemy. Their destruction was not merely a result of Palpatine's cunning, but of their own refusal to adapt to the realities of the galaxy. The fall of the Jedi Order is a cautionary tale about the dangers of rigidity and detachment. Their failure to adapt their teachings to the needs of individuals like Anakin Skywalker, combined with their inability to recognize the changing nature of the galaxy, led to their destruction. Anakin's fall and the rise of Darth Sidious were not isolated events, but interconnected outcomes of the Jedi's systemic failures. Their detachment from emotion, their adherence to dogma, and their blindness to the larger picture allowed the Sith to rise unchecked and ensured their own demise. In the end, the Jedi's destruction was a tragedy of their own making. Their inability to guide Anakin and their failure to confront Palpatine were not separate failings but two sides of the same coin. Their philosophy, which sought to suppress emotion and prioritize detachment, left them ill-equipped to navigate the complexities of the galaxy and the challenges they faced. The rise of Darth Sidious and the fall of Anakin Skywalker stand as stark reminders of the cost of inflexibility and the need for understanding and adaptability in the face of change. The Jedi Order, for all its noble ideals, became a victim of its inability to evolve, leaving the galaxy to fall into darkness. Anakin Skywalker's story is one of profound tragedy, not because he was inherently a villain, but because he was a victim of two opposing systems, both the Sith and the Jedi, each of which failed him in their own way. The Jedi, with their rigid detachment and inability to empathize with his unique struggles, created an emotional void in Anakin's life, isolating him from the very support he needed to navigate his immense potential and profound inner turmoil. On the other hand, the Sith, embodied by the insidious Darth Sidious, exploited Anakin's virtues, his love, his fear of loss, and his desire to protect others, manipulating his selflessness into a tool of destruction. The Jedi Order, despite its noble intentions, acted as the first architects of Anakin's undoing. Their philosophy, rooted in detachment and suppression of emotion, failed to recognize the importance of understanding and addressing the human condition. For Anakin, whose life was shaped by the intense bonds of family and love, the Jedi Code became a straitjacket that stifled his identity. Their inability to adapt their teachings to accommodate his individuality left Anakin feeling alienated and mistrusted, fostering a growing resentment and confusion. Instead of guiding him through his fears and emotions, the Jedi demanded that he bury them, an approach that left him vulnerable to the temptations of the dark side. Conversely, the Sith preyed on the very qualities that made Anakin exceptional. Palpatine recognized Anakin's fear of loss and his desperate need to protect those he loved, particularly Padmé, and used these vulnerabilities to entrap him. Under the guise of friendship and mentorship, Palpatine presented the dark side as the only path to saving Padmé's life, a path not born from greed or malice, but from Anakin's selfless desire to prevent suffering. The Sith twisted his noble intentions into acts of horror, exploiting his goodness to serve their own ends. In the end, Anakin's transformation into Darth Vader was not the result of some inherent darkness or unrestrained ambition, but the culmination of the failures of both the Jedi and the Sith. The Jedi, with their detachment, failed to provide the understanding and support that could have anchored Anakin. The Sith, with their cunning, turned his virtues into chains that bound him to their will. Both systems reduced him to a pawn in their larger conflict, ignoring his humanity and the complexity of his emotions. Anakin Skywalker's life was marked by love, loss, and the desperate desire to do good in a galaxy that offered him no clear path. He was a victim of forces far greater than himself, manipulated and betrayed by both sides of a conflict that cared little for the individual. He wanted to save those he loved, to bring peace and order to the galaxy. But in his efforts, he was consumed by a battle between ideologies that neither valued nor understood him. In this light, Anakin Skywalker was not the villain of his story, but its greatest casualty. His fall was not a personal failing, but a consequence of being caught between the unyielding dogma of the Jedi and the predatory machinations of the Sith. Both orders failed to see Anakin for who he truly was, a man of immense power and profound emotion, seeking a way to reconcile his humanity with his destiny. His life serves as a poignant reminder of the cost of inflexibility, misunderstanding, and manipulation, making him a tragic victim of the very forces that sought to control him.